The telegram arrived on the coldest morning of February 1878, its yellow paper crackling like autumn leaves as Rebecca Hayes read the words that would shatter her carefully constructed world. Marriage arrangement dissolved. Stop. Cannot accept. Damaged goods. Stop. Do not come to Montana. Stop. Money non-refundable. Stop. She read it 3 times before the meaning penetrated the fog of disbelief that clouded her mind. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca sank into the worn wooden chair beside her boarding house window, her right leg trembling while her left leg, or rather, the carved wooden prosthetic that had replaced it below the knee, remained perfectly still. The contrast between her body's natural response and the artificial stillness of her prosthetic seemed to mock her. In this moment of devastation, 6 months of correspondence with Samuel Morrison had led to this moment. 6 months of carefully crafted letters where she had been completely honest about her condition, describing how a mill accident in Pennsylvania had claimed her lower left leg when she was 19. Samuel had seemed understanding, even admiring of her resilience. A woman who has faced such trials and emerged stronger shows the kind of character needed for frontier life. He had written in his flowing script, the boarding house room in Philadelphia suddenly felt smaller than ever. Rebecca had already given notice to Mrs. Patterson, sold her few belongings, and used nearly all her savings to purchase the train tickets to Montana Territory. The remaining coins in her small purse would barely cover food for a week, let alone rent for another month in this cramped space that smelled perpetually of cabbage and broken dreams. Rebecca had been orphaned at 16, when her parents died in the same mill accident that claimed her leg. The falling timber that crushed her limb had also killed her father instantly and left her mother with injuries that claimed her life 3 days later. The mill owner had provided a small settlement, enough for a basic prosthetic and a few months of medical care, but nothing that could restore the life Rebecca had known. For 7 years, she had survived in Philadelphia through a combination of seamstress work and taking in laundry. The physical demands were manageable with her prosthetic, though the long days standing over a washboard left her residual limb aching by evening. More challenging was the constant stream of pitying glances and whispered comments from customers who saw her disability before they saw her skilled needlework or efficient service. The mail-order bride advertisements had seemed like a pathway to something better. The Western Territories promised fresh starts for those willing to work hard, and Rebecca had grown weary of being defined by tragedy rather than capability. When Samuel Morrison's advertisement appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer, seeking a woman of good moral character willing to share the challenges and rewards of operating a lumber mill in the Montana Territory, Rebecca had felt a spark of hope she hadn't experienced in years. Samuel's letters had painted a picture of a man who understood hardship. He had described losing his first wife to influenza 3 years earlier, and the struggles of managing both his lumber operation and caring for his young daughter alone. His request for a partner rather than just a wife had appealed to Rebecca's desire to be valued for what she could contribute rather than what she lacked. Now, staring at the telegram that destroyed those hopes, Rebecca felt the familiar weight of societal judgment crushing down upon her. Someone, perhaps a neighbor or acquaintance in Montana, had obviously informed Samuel about her prosthetic leg, describing her in terms that made her sound like defective merchandise rather than a human being with feelings and capabilities. The boarding house hallway creaked with footsteps as other residents began their morning routines. Rebecca could hear Mrs. Patterson's voice drifting up from the kitchen below, discussing the weather with one of the long-term boarders. The normal sounds of daily life continued around her while her own world crumbled into pieces. Rebecca forced herself to stand and walk to the small mirror mounted on the wall beside her washstand. The face looking back at her showed the wear of recent stress, dark circles under green eyes that had once sparkled with optimism, auburn hair pulled back, in a practical style that emphasized the sharp angles hunger had carved into her cheeks. At 26, she was still young enough to rebuild her life, but the options available to a woman with a disability in 1878 Philadelphia were desperately limited. The seamstress work that had sustained her was becoming increasingly difficult to secure. Newer immigrants were willing to work for lower wages, and customers often preferred to place their orders with establishments that employed only able-bodied workers. The Industrial Revolution had brought efficiency and standardization that left little room for those who worked differently, even when their results were superior. Rebecca's savings, carefully accumulated over months of strict economy, had been invested in the train tickets and traveling clothes appropriate for meeting her intended husband. The burgundy wool dress hanging in her narrow wardrobe represented weeks of careful needlework, created specifically to make a good impression upon arrival in Montana. The matching hat and gloves had consumed additional precious resources, purchased with the optimistic belief that investing in her appearance would help secure her future. A knock at her door interrupted Rebecca's increasingly desperate thoughts. Mrs. Patterson's voice called through the thin wood, carrying the forced cheerfulness that barely concealed the landlady's impatience with tenants who struggled to pay rent promptly. "Miss Hayes, there's a gentleman here asking to speak with you. Says it's regarding your travel plans." Rebecca's heart leaped with irrational hope. Perhaps Samuel had reconsidered, or maybe there had been some misunderstanding that could be resolved. She quickly smoothed her hair and checked that her skirts properly concealed her prosthetic before opening the door. Mrs. Patterson stood in the hallway beside a thin man in a railroad uniform who held his cap in weathered hands. His expression was professionally sympathetic but distant, suggesting he delivered unwelcome news frequently enough to have developed emotional armor against its impact. "Miss Hayes," the railroad man began without preamble, "I'm Thomas Burke from the Pennsylvania Railroad. I understand you purchased tickets to Montana Territory for travel next week. I'm here to inform you that those tickets have been canceled by request of the receiving party. The fare has been forfeited according to our standard policies regarding canceled arrangements." The words hit Rebecca like physical blows. Not only had Samuel rejected her, but he had also ensured that she couldn't even attempt to change his mind by arriving unannounced. The financial loss of the canceled tickets represented nearly 6 months of careful savings, money she desperately needed for basic survival. "I see," Rebecca managed, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "Thank you for informing me." She closed the door before either visitor could see the tears that threatened to overwhelm her composure. Alone again, Rebecca sank onto her narrow bed and forced herself to assess her situation with the practical mindset that had helped her survive 7 years of independence. The rent on her room was due in 10 days, and her remaining money would cover either food or lodging, but not both. The seamstress work that had sustained her was no longer reliable, and the winter months typically brought reduced demand for the laundry services that supplemented her income. Rebecca's few relatives in Pennsylvania had made it clear after her parents' funeral that they considered her a burden rather than a responsibility. Her father's brother had offered grudging assistance with the immediate medical expenses, but had emphasized that his own family's needs prevented any long-term support. Her mother's sister had attended the funeral, but had avoided discussing Rebecca's future circumstances, clearly hoping someone else would assume responsibility for the orphaned girl with a disability. The isolation of her current situation felt overwhelming. 7 years of struggling alone had taught Rebecca to rely on her own resources, but those resources were now exhausted. The independence she had fought so hard to maintain was crumbling, threatening to leave her dependent on charity organizations that would view her disability as confirmation of her inability to contribute meaningfully to society. Rebecca walked to her window and gazed down at the Philadelphia street bustling with morning activity. Horse-drawn carriages navigated between pedestrians hurrying to their destinations. their purpose and direction a stark contrast to her own aimless desperation. The city that had been her home for 7 years suddenly felt foreign and unwelcoming, as if her rejection by Samuel Morrison had somehow marked her as an outsider even among familiar surroundings. The newspaper on her small table contained the same mail-order bride advertisements that had led to her current predicament. Rebecca found herself scanning them again, searching for possibilities that might offer escape from her deteriorating circumstances. Most advertisements specified requirements that effectively excluded her demands for young, healthy women capable of bearing children and managing demanding physical labor. One advertisement caught her attention because of its unusual phrasing. Seeking capable woman for partnership in mountaineering guide service, Colorado Territory. Physical challenges are welcome as evidence of determination. Character matters more than convention. Write to Jane Sullivan, Pine Ridge, Colorado. The wording was different enough from the typical requests for domestic partners that Rebecca found herself reading it multiple times. The mention of physical challenges welcome seemed almost too good to be true. Rebecca had learned to be suspicious of opportunities that seemed specifically designed for her circumstances, having encountered too many situations where initial apparent acceptance turned into rejection once the full reality of her disability became clear. But the alternative, remaining in Philadelphia to face inevitable destitution, was becoming increasingly impossible to ignore. Rebecca spent the afternoon composing a letter to James Sullivan, struggling to find words that were honest about her circumstances without emphasizing her limitations. She described her prosthetic leg straightforwardly, explaining the accident that had necessitated it and detailing the adaptations she had developed for managing daily tasks. More importantly, she emphasized her experience with challenging physical work and her willingness to learn new skills required for mountain life. The letter consumed her last sheet of quality writing paper and required 3 drafts before Rebecca felt satisfied with its tone. She had learned from her correspondence with Samuel Morrison that complete honesty was both necessary and risky. Necessary because deception would inevitably be discovered, but risky because truth often triggered immediate rejection. As Rebecca sealed the letter and prepared to walk to the post office, she realized that she was taking perhaps the most desperate gamble of her life. Her remaining money would barely cover postage and a week of modest meals. If James Sullivan's response was negative, or if no response came at all, she would face complete destitution within days. The post office clerk accepted her letter with professional indifference, unaware that the small envelope represented Rebecca's last hope for avoiding the poorhouse or worse. The return address she had provided was the boarding house, though she wasn't certain she could afford to remain there long enough to receive a reply. Walking back through Philadelphia's crowded streets, Rebecca felt the weight of her decision settling around her like a heavy cloak. She had committed herself to a course of action that offered no retreat and no alternative plans. Either James Sullivan would provide an opportunity for rebuilding her life, or she would face the complete collapse of her independence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That evening, Rebecca sat in her small room calculating and recalculating her remaining resources. The coins in her purse could stretch to cover perhaps 5 days of basic meals if she avoided rent payment, or 3 days if she attempted to maintain her lodging. The mathematics of survival had become brutally simple, stripping away all considerations except the most basic requirements for staying alive. Rebecca's landlady knocked again as darkness fell, this time with barely concealed irritation about the rent that would be due soon. Mrs. Patterson's sympathy for difficult circumstances had clear limits, and her boarding house operated on schedules that allowed little flexibility for tenants facing temporary setbacks. "I understand your situation, dear," Mrs. Patterson said with forced kindness, "but I have my own obligations to meet. Perhaps you could seek assistance from one of the charitable organizations that help young women in difficult circumstances. The suggestion, though practical, felt like admission of complete failure to Rebecca. The charitable organizations Mrs. Patterson referenced would expect her to accept whatever work they deemed appropriate for a woman with a disability, typically involving domestic service in situations where her prosthetic leg would be viewed as a limitation requiring accommodation rather than evidence of resilience. Alone again, Rebecca found herself staring at the wooden prosthetic that had become such a defining feature of her existence. The device was well crafted and functional, allowing her to walk with only a slight limp and to perform most tasks with minor modifications. But society's perception of her prosthetic consistently overshadowed her actual capabilities, reducing her to a collection of limitations rather than recognizing her as a complete person with valuable skills and experiences. The irony of her situation wasn't lost on Rebecca. The mill accident that had claimed her leg had also killed both parents and destroyed her family's financial security. Yet she had somehow survived and rebuilt a life of modest independence. 7 years of adaptation had taught her to solve problems creatively, to work efficiently despite physical challenges, and to persist through difficulties that might overwhelm others. These qualities should have made her valuable to frontier communities that prized resourcefulness and determination. But societal prejudices consistently prevented others from recognizing her strengths. As Rebecca prepared for bed, she whispered a prayer that James Sullivan would prove different from Samuel Morrison and the countless others who had seen her disability before seeing her capabilities. The letter she had posted represented more than a request for employment. It was a plea for the chance to prove that her worth as a human being extended far beyond the physical characteristics that seemed to define others' perceptions of her. The night stretched endlessly as Rebecca lay awake contemplating the possibilities that awaited her response from Colorado Territory. Either she would receive an opportunity to rebuild her life in circumstances where her adaptability might be valued, or she would face the final collapse of her independence and the necessity of accepting whatever charity others deemed appropriate. For someone in her circumstances, Philadelphia's sounds gradually quieted as the city settled into sleep. But Rebecca remained alert, her mind racing through scenarios both hopeful and terrifying. Tomorrow would bring either progress toward a solution or further deterioration of her situation, and she would face whatever came with the same determination that had carried her through 7 years of challenging independence. The wooden prosthetic stood beside her bed like a silent reminder of both limitation and resilience, representing the physical challenge that had shaped her adult life, while also symbolizing her refusal to be defeated by circumstances beyond her control. Whatever response came from Colorado Territory, Rebecca knew she would face it with the same courage that had sustained her through every crisis since the accident that had changed everything. Sleep finally came near dawn, bringing dreams of mountain landscapes and possibilities that stretched beyond the narrow confines of Philadelphia's expectations. The train's whistle pierced the thin mountain air as Rebecca Hayes stepped onto the wooden platform at Pine Ridge, Colorado Territory, her heart hammering against her ribs with a mixture of anticipation and terror. The journey from Philadelphia had taken 4 days of cramped seats, stale food, and restless nights, but James Sullivan's telegram had made the difficult trip possible. Position available. Send travel expenses. Arrive at Pine Ridge Station Monday. Morning J. Sullivan. The money order that accompanied his message had been exactly enough for train fare and modest meals, with $3 remaining for emergencies. Rebecca had sewn the extra coins into the lining of her traveling dress, knowing that her survival might depend on those few dollars if circumstances proved unfavorable. Pine Ridge looked nothing like the bustling industrial centers Rebecca had known in Pennsylvania. The town consisted of perhaps 20 buildings scattered along a single main street, dwarfed by towering peaks that seemed to scrape the sky itself. The air was so crisp and thin that each breath felt inadequate, leaving Rebecca slightly lightheaded as she gathered her 2 small bags and scanned the platform for someone who might be James Sullivan. The other passengers dispersed quickly, greeted by family members or heading toward the town's few commercial establishments. Rebecca found herself standing alone on the platform as the train prepared for departure, its coal smoke mixing with the scent of pine trees and something else she couldn't identify, perhaps the smell of snow, though it was only late September. A gruff voice behind her called out, "You the lady writing about the guide work?" Rebecca turned to see a weathered man in his 50s approaching with obvious reluctance. His clothing was practical but well-maintained, suggesting someone who understood the value of good equipment but wasn't concerned with fashion. What struck Rebecca immediately was the man's expression, a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed disappointment. "I'm Rebecca Hayes," she replied, extending her hand with more confidence than she felt. "I assume you're Mr. Sullivan?" The man shook her hand briefly, his calloused palm rough against her skin. "James Sullivan, that's right. Got your letter about the position." His eyes traveled down to her skirts, clearly trying to assess the leg she had described in her correspondence. "Didn't expect someone quite so ... He paused, apparently searching for diplomatic phrasing. "Someone quite so what, Mr. Sullivan?" Rebecca kept her voice level despite the familiar sinking feeling in her stomach. "Well refined, I suppose. City bred. The work I'm offering isn't exactly suitable for ladies accustomed to urban conveniences." James shifted uncomfortably, avoiding direct mention of her prosthetic while making it clear that her overall appearance concerned him. Rebecca straightened her shoulders, recognizing the beginning of another rejection. "Perhaps you could describe the specific requirements of the position before making assumptions about my capabilities. Your advertisement mentioned that physical challenges were welcome as evidence of determination." James scratched his beard and glanced around the nearly empty platform as if hoping for rescue from an awkward conversation. "The thing is, Miss Hayes, I've been thinking about this arrangement since receiving your letter. Running a mountain guide service requires capabilities that might be challenging for someone in your particular circumstances." The careful phrasing couldn't disguise what Rebecca was hearing. Despite his written assurance that physical challenges were welcome, James Sullivan was having second thoughts about employing a woman with a prosthetic leg. The pattern was devastatingly familiar: initial acceptance, followed by rejection once the reality of her disability became concrete rather than abstract. "Mr. Sullivan," Rebecca said firmly, "I traveled 4 days to reach Pine Ridge based on your telegram confirming that the position was available. I invested my last resources in this journey because you indicated that my circumstances were acceptable for the work you're offering. If you've changed your mind, I deserve an honest explanation rather than diplomatic evasion." James looked genuinely uncomfortable, clearly not accustomed to such direct confrontation from women seeking employment. "It's not that I've changed my mind exactly. It's just that seeing you here, I'm wondering if I was being unrealistic about what the work actually involves. Then perhaps you could explain what the work actually involves instead of making assumptions about what I can or cannot do." Rebecca's patience was wearing thin, but she forced herself to remain professional. Losing her temper would only confirm whatever prejudices James might harbor about women or people with disabilities. James gestured toward the mountains surrounding Pine Ridge, their snow-capped peaks gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. "I guide hunting parties and survey teams into the high country. We're talking about traveling on foot or horseback for days at a time, camping in all weather conditions, navigating terrain that can be dangerous even for experienced mountaineers. The clients pay well because they know I can get them safely to places other guides won't attempt." Rebecca studied the imposing landscape, trying to imagine herself navigating those steep slopes and rocky outcroppings with her prosthetic leg. The challenge was undeniably daunting, but she had faced seemingly impossible obstacles before, and found ways to adapt. What specific tasks would I be responsible for? She asked, determined to understand the practical requirements rather than accepting vague concerns about her general suitability. Cooking for the expeditions, managing equipment and supplies, maintaining base camps while the clients are pursuing their objectives, sometimes helping with navigation or wildlife tracking when we encounter situations that require additional hands. James paused, then added, "The clients expect professional service, and they're not typically understanding about accommodations for physical limitations." Rebecca absorbed this information, recognizing both the legitimate challenges James described and the assumptions embedded in his concerns. "Mr. Sullivan, I've spent 7 years adapting to perform demanding physical work with my prosthetic leg. I've learned to manage tasks that others assume would be impossible for someone in my circumstances. Perhaps instead of debating theoretical limitations, you could allow me to demonstrate actual capabilities." James glanced toward the town, clearly torn between his need for assistance and his doubts about Rebecca's suitability. "Miss Hayes, I appreciate your determination, but I have a reputation to maintain. If I take clients into the mountains with someone who can't keep up or handle the physical demands, it could destroy everything I've built here." The rejection was becoming explicit despite James's attempts at diplomatic language. Rebecca felt the familiar anger rising, not just at this particular situation, but at the endless pattern of being judged by assumptions rather than evidence. She had traveled across the continent based on James Sullivan's assurance that physical challenges were welcome, only to discover that his actual attitude was no different from countless others who saw her disability before seeing her capabilities. "Mr. Sullivan," Rebecca said coldly, "your advertisement specifically stated that physical challenges were welcome as evidence of determination. You confirmed in your telegram that the position was available after I clearly described my circumstances. You sent money for travel expenses, encouraging me to make this journey. Now you're suggesting that my prosthetic leg makes me unsuitable for work you previously indicated would benefit from the kind of adaptability that dealing with physical challenges develops." James looked increasingly uncomfortable as Rebecca cataloged his contradictory messages. "I may have been overly optimistic about the possibilities when I wrote that advertisement. Sometimes what sounds reasonable in theory proves impractical in reality. Or sometimes people's prejudices overcome their better judgment when faced with actual circumstances rather than abstract concepts." Rebecca replied sharply. The diplomatic restraint she had maintained was beginning to crack under the weight of disappointment and financial desperation. A wagon approached the station, driven by a young man who appeared to be in his 20s. He pulled up beside James and Rebecca, studying their tense conversation with obvious curiosity. "Everything all right here, Uncle James?" "This is Miss Hayes, the lady who wrote about the guide work," James explained to his nephew. "We're just discussing whether the position might be suitable for her particular circumstances." The young man climbed down from the wagon and approached Rebecca with a friendly smile that seemed genuinely welcoming. "I'm Daniel Sullivan, James's nephew. I help with the guide service when I'm not working on my own claims." He glanced at James with an expression that suggested familiarity with his uncle's tendency toward overcaution. "Miss Hayes has a prosthetic leg," James explained bluntly, apparently deciding that diplomatic language was no longer necessary. "I'm concerned about whether she could handle the physical demands of mountain guiding." Daniel's expression didn't change as he processed this information. "Mind if I ask how you lost your leg, Miss Hayes? Was it recent?" Rebecca appreciated his direct approach, which felt more respectful than James's awkward evasions. "A mill accident 7 years ago. I've been managing independently since then, working as a seamstress and taking in laundry in Philadelphia." 7 years of independence with a prosthetic leg, Daniel mused, glancing meaningfully at his uncle. Sounds like exactly the kind of problem-solving experience that could be valuable in mountain work. Most of our clients have never faced any real challenges in their lives. They panic when things don't go according to plan. James shot his nephew with an irritated look. This isn't about problem-solving experience, Daniel. It's about being able to keep up on difficult terrain while carrying equipment and managing camp duties. Has Miss Hayes had an opportunity to demonstrate what she can actually do? Daniel asked mildly. Or are we making decisions based on assumptions about what people with prosthetic legs can't accomplish? Rebecca felt a surge of gratitude toward Daniel for framing the issue so clearly. I would welcome the opportunity to demonstrate my capabilities rather than defending against theoretical concerns about my limitations. James looked between Rebecca and his nephew, clearly recognizing that his position was becoming difficult to defend. Even if Miss Hayes could handle the physical aspects of the work, there's still the question of client expectations. These are wealthy men who pay premium prices for premium service. They're not going to be understanding about accommodations or modifications to standard procedures. The clients pay for results, not for conventional appearances, Daniel countered. If Miss Hayes can contribute to successful expeditions, why would they care about her prosthetic leg? Most of them are more concerned with getting their trophy animals or completing their surveys than with judging the guide staff's physical characteristics. Rebecca watched this family debate with growing hope that Daniel's influence might overcome James's reluctance. The nephew clearly had different attitudes about capability and accommodation than his uncle, possibly due to generational differences or simply more open-minded personality. Mr. Sullivan, Rebecca interjected, I understand your concerns about client expectations and operational effectiveness. Would you be willing to arrange a trial period where I could demonstrate my capabilities before making a final decision about permanent employment? I'm confident that actual performance would address your concerns more effectively than theoretical discussions. James considered this proposal while Daniel nodded approvingly. That seems fair, Uncle James. Give Miss Hayes a chance to prove herself instead of assuming she can't do the work. The problem is timing, James said reluctantly. I have a hunting party arriving next week for a 10-day expedition into the high country. If Miss Hayes couldn't handle the work, it would be too late to find alternative arrangements. Then test her capabilities on a shorter local expedition first, Daniel suggested. Take her up to Eagle's Nest Lake for a couple of days. If she can handle that terrain and camping conditions, she should be fine for the longer expeditions. Rebecca's heart leaped at this compromise solution. Eagle's Nest Lake was presumably a less demanding destination that would allow her to prove her capabilities without risking a major expedition if problems arose. I would be very grateful for such an opportunity, Rebecca said earnestly. I'm confident that actual experience would demonstrate my suitability for this work better than any amount of discussion about theoretical limitations, James sighed, heavily, clearly torn between his nephew's logic and his own reservations. The accommodation situation is already complicated, Miss Hayes. I don't have separate quarters for female employees, and the camping arrangements during expeditions assume all-male crews. I can handle rustic accommodations and camping conditions, Rebecca assured him. My priority is proving that I can do the work effectively, not obtaining special treatment because of my gender or disability. Daniel grinned at his uncle's mounting list of objections. Come on, James. You've been complaining for months about needing reliable help with the guide service. Miss Hayes traveled all the way from Philadelphia based on your advertisement. The least you can do is give her a fair chance to prove herself. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. 3 riders came into view, heading toward the train station with the confident bearing of men accustomed to command. James straightened noticeably as he recognized the approaching group. That's Colonel Morrison and his associates, James murmured to Daniel. They're the hunting party I mentioned arriving earlier than expected. He glanced nervously at Rebecca, clearly concerned about how these potential clients might react to discovering a woman with a prosthetic leg among the guide service staff. Rebecca quickly assessed the approaching riders, recognizing the type of wealthy, demanding clientele that James was worried about disappointing. These were clearly men accustomed to having their expectations met precisely, and their reaction to her presence could determine whether she received any opportunity to prove her capabilities. Colonel Morrison was a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, with silver hair and bearing that suggested military background and considerable wealth. His companions appeared to be successful businessmen or professionals, well-dressed and confident in the manner of people whose money typically ensured that their wishes were accommodated without question. "Sullivan," Colonel Morrison called out as he dismounted near the platform. "Glad to see you're here. We decided to arrive early and get started with the expedition preparations." His eyes swept over the group, pausing when he noticed Rebecca. "I hope we're not interrupting business discussions." "Not at all, Colonel Morrison," James replied with forced cheerfulness. "This is Miss Hayes, who has applied for a position with the guide service. We were just discussing the arrangements." Colonel Morrison studied Rebecca with the assessing gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating personnel for important assignments. "A woman guide? That's unusual for mountain expeditions, isn't it?" Miss Hayes would be handling camp management and equipment organization rather than direct guiding responsibilities, James explained hastily, clearly trying to minimize any concerns the colonel might have about unconventional staffing. "Interesting," Colonel Morrison mused, his attention focused on Rebecca with what seemed like genuine curiosity rather than immediate disapproval. "And what experience do you have with wilderness camping and expedition support, Miss Haas?" Rebecca recognized this as a crucial moment that could determine her future prospects. "I'm experienced with challenging physical work and adapting to difficult conditions, Colonel Morrison. I understand that expedition success depends on reliable, efficient camp management and equipment handling. I'm confident I can contribute effectively to the support operations." One of Colonel Morrison's companions, a heavy-set man with expensive clothing and skeptical expression, leaned forward in his saddle. "Support operations for mountain expeditions require considerable physical capability, young lady. Are you certain you understand what such work entails?" The question gave Rebecca an opening to address her prosthetic leg directly, rather than allowing others to speculate about hidden limitations. "I have a prosthetic leg below the knee, sir, the result of an industrial accident 7 years ago. I've learned to manage demanding physical tasks through adaptation and determination. I believe these qualities would be valuable for expedition support work." The directness of her response seemed to surprise all three men. Colonel Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained thoughtful rather than dismissive. "A prosthetic leg," he repeated. "And you're seeking employment in mountain guide services?" "Yes, sir. I believe that learning to work effectively despite physical challenges has prepared me well for the problem-solving and adaptability that expedition work requires." Colonel Morrison exchanged glances with his companions before dismounting completely and approaching Rebecca. "May I ask how you manage difficult terrain with your prosthetic? I'm curious about the practical aspects rather than making judgments about your capabilities." Rebecca appreciated the colonel's straightforward approach, which reminded her of Daniel Sullivan's direct questions earlier. "I've developed techniques for maintaining balance and stability on uneven surfaces. The prosthetic is well fitted and allows normal walking with only slight modification to my gait. I find that careful attention to footing and equipment placement usually compensates for any limitations in flexibility." "Fascinating," Colonel Morrison said genuinely. "I've encountered amputees during my military service, but most were invalided out rather than adapting to continued demanding work. Your persistence is admirable." James Sullivan looked increasingly uncomfortable as Colonel Morrison showed interest rather than concern about Rebecca's prosthetic leg. Clearly, the guide service Owner had expected client disapproval to support his own reluctance about employing her. "Colonel," James interjected, "perhaps we should discuss the expedition details and leave employment decisions for later consideration." "Nonsense, Sullivan," Colonel Morrison replied firmly. "If Miss Hayes is going to be part of the expedition support team, I want to understand her capabilities now rather than discovering limitations in the field." He turned back to Rebecca. "What specific tasks do you believe you could handle effectively during a wilderness expedition?" Rebecca felt excitement building as she recognized genuine interest from this influential potential client. "Camp setup and breakdown, meal preparation, equipment organization and maintenance, basic medical assistance for minor injuries, and any other support tasks that don't require specialized mountain climbing skills." "And you believe your prosthetic leg wouldn't interfere with these responsibilities?" "I believe my experience adapting to physical challenges would enhance my effectiveness in these responsibilities," Rebecca replied confidently. 7 years of solving problems that others consider impossible has taught me to find efficient solutions for almost any situation. Colonel Morrison smiled for the first time since arriving. "An excellent attitude, Miss Hayes. I appreciate people who focus on solutions rather than dwelling on obstacles." He glanced at James Sullivan with an expression that clearly conveyed his opinion about the guide's apparent reluctance. "Colonel Morrison," James said carefully, "while I appreciate your interest in Miss Hayes's background, I haven't yet determined whether she's suitable for the demands of expedition work. Perhaps it would be premature to include her in planning for your hunting trip." "On the contrary, Sullivan," Colonel Morrison replied with quiet authority, "I think Miss Hayes's attitude and experience could be valuable assets for expedition work. If she's willing to take on the challenges, I see no reason why her prosthetic leg should disqualify her from consideration." Rebecca could hardly believe what she was hearing. After expecting rejection or reluctant accommodation, she was receiving enthusiastic support from the very client whose disapproval James had feared most. Daniel Sullivan grinned broadly at this unexpected turn of events. "Sounds like Miss Hayes has passed the client approval test, Uncle James. Maybe now we can arrange that trial expedition to Eagle's Nest Lake." James looked cornered by the combined pressure from his nephew and his most important client. "I suppose we could arrange a brief trial expedition to assess Miss Hayes's capabilities under actual field conditions." "Excellent," Colonel Morrison declared. "When can this assessment expedition be arranged? I'd like to observe Miss Hayes's performance before committing to the longer hunting expedition." Rebecca's pulse quickened as she realized that her trial period would be conducted under the scrutiny of the very clients she hoped to serve. The stakes couldn't be higher. Success would establish her value to the guide service, while failure would eliminate any possibility of employment. "We could arrange the Eagle's Nest Lake expedition for this weekend," Daniel suggested. 2 days of camping and hiking should provide a good assessment of Miss Hayes's field capabilities. "Perfect," Colonel Morrison agreed. "My associates and I will observe the expedition preparations and perhaps join the first day's activities to evaluate Miss Hayes's performance." He smiled at Rebecca encouragingly. "Consider this your audition, Miss Hayes. Show us what you can accomplish." As the group began discussing logistical arrangements for the trial expedition, Rebecca realized that her arrival in Pine Ridge had taken a completely unexpected turn. Instead of facing immediate rejection as she had feared, she found herself preparing for a high-stakes demonstration that could establish her future in the Colorado Territory. The mountains looming around Pine Ridge no longer seemed quite so intimidating. They represented challenge and opportunity rather than just obstacle and danger. Rebecca had traveled across the continent, seeking a chance to prove her worth, and now she would have that opportunity under conditions that would leave no doubt about her capabilities. Whatever happened during the trial expedition, Rebecca knew she would face it with the same determination that had carried her through 7 years of independent survival. The prosthetic leg that had seemed like such a barrier to acceptance might finally become the foundation for demonstrating that limitations could be transformed into unique strengths. Dawn broke over Pine Ridge with a crisp clarity that made the surrounding peaks appear close enough to touch, though Rebecca knew they were miles away. She had spent the night in a small room above Henderson's general store, the proprietor's wife having offered basic accommodations when it became clear that the town's single boarding house was fully occupied by mining surveyors. Rebecca examined her prosthetic leg carefully in the morning light, checking the leather straps and wooden joints that would need to perform flawlessly during the trial expedition. 7 years of daily use had taught her to identify potential problems before they became dangerous failures, and today's test would push the device to its limits. The knock on her door came precisely at sunrise, followed by Daniel Sullivan's cheerful voice. "Miss Hayes, Uncle James sent me to collect you for equipment fitting. We need to get you properly outfitted before heading up to Eagle's Nest Lake." Rebecca opened the door to find Daniel carrying an armload of mountain gear that looked both essential and intimidating. Heavy boots, thick woolen clothing, leather gloves, and various pieces of equipment whose purposes she could only guess had filled his arms. "Good morning, Mr. Sullivan. I appreciate your uncle's thoroughness in providing equipment." Rebecca stepped aside to allow Daniel into the small room, noting how his cheerful demeanor seemed unaffected by the early hour or the weight of gear he was carrying. "Will your cousin mind me borrowing her clothing? Sarah specifically left her mountain gear for situations like this. She always said the mountains were big enough for anyone brave enough to face them properly equipped." Daniel smiled at what was obviously a fond memory. She'd be pleased to know her gear was helping another woman get started in mountain work. The equipment fitting continued with items Rebecca had never seen before: crampon attachments for the boots, a specialized walking stick designed for mountain terrain, and a compact emergency kit containing everything from medical supplies to fire-starting materials. Each piece reflected practical experience with mountain conditions and attention to details that could prevent serious problems. "The walking stick is particularly important for your situation," Daniel explained, demonstrating its adjustable length and specialized grip. "It's designed to provide extra stability on uneven terrain, while also serving as a probe for testing snow conditions or loose rocks." Rebecca tested the walking stick's balance and adjustability, immediately recognizing how it would complement her prosthetic leg's limitations. The device would allow her to maintain 3 points of contact with the ground when navigating difficult terrain, significantly improving her stability and confidence. "This is ingenious," she said, practicing the walking technique Daniel demonstrated. "It transforms what could be a limitation into a systematic approach to terrain navigation." Exactly. Mountain work is all about systematic approaches and redundant safety measures. Your prosthetic leg just means you need to be more systematic than most people, which often leads to better overall performance. James Sullivan appeared in the doorway as Rebecca was practicing with the walking stick, his expression still showing uncertainty about the upcoming trial. "Morning, Miss Hayes. I see Daniel has you equipped for mountain conditions. Are you ready for what we're attempting today?" "I'm as ready as preparation can make me, Mr. Sullivan. The equipment you've provided is excellent, and Daniel's instruction has been very helpful." Rebecca straightened her shoulders, determined to project confidence despite her own nervousness. About the trial ahead. The trail to Eagle's Nest Lake isn't particularly technical, but it does involve significant elevation gain and some tricky footing in places. We'll be carrying full expedition gear to simulate actual working conditions. James studied Rebecca's outfit and equipment with professional assessment. "Colonel Morrison and his associates will accompany us for the first portion of the hike to observe your performance." Rebecca felt her stomach tighten at the reminder that she would be performing under direct scrutiny from the clients whose approval could determine her future. "I understand the importance of today's demonstration, Mr. Sullivan. I won't disappoint you." See that you don't. My reputation depends on reliable performance from everyone associated with the guide service. James's tone was businesslike but not unfriendly, suggesting professional standards rather than personal hostility. The group assembled at Henderson's General Store as the sun climbed above the eastern peaks, casting long shadows across pine ridges. Main Street. Colonel Morrison and his 2 associates arrived mounted on fine horses, their equipment and clothing showing the kind of quality that unlimited budgets could provide. "Good morning, Miss Hayes," Colonel Morrison called out cheerfully, as he dismounted. "Excellent weather for your trial expedition. Clear skies and mild temperatures should give you optimal conditions for demonstrating your capabilities." "Good morning, Colonel Morrison. I appreciate your interest in observing today's activities." Rebecca secured her pack and tested her walking stick's adjustment one final time, aware that every movement was being evaluated by potential clients. James Sullivan shouldered his own pack and gestured toward the trail that led up into the mountains behind Pine Ridge. "We'll hike together for the first 2 miles. Then Colonel Morrison's group will return to town while Miss Hayes and I continue to Eagle's Nest Lake for overnight camping." The trail began gently enough, winding through stands of aspen trees whose leaves were just beginning to show autumn colors. Rebecca found her rhythm quickly, using the walking stick to maintain steady progress while her prosthetic leg adapted to the uneven terrain. The specialized boots provided excellent traction and support, allowing her to focus on navigation rather than worrying about stability. Colonel Morrison rode alongside the hiking group, maintaining conversation while observing Rebecca's technique and endurance. "You move very efficiently, Miss Hayes. Have you done much hiking on mountain terrain before?" "Not on mountains specifically, but I've learned to adapt my movement patterns to various challenging surfaces over the years." The principles seemed similar: careful foot placement, attention to balance, and systematic progression rather than rushing. Rebecca appreciated the Colonel's continued interest in her methods rather than focusing on her limitations. "Sound principles for mountain travel," Colonel Morrison agreed. "Many experienced hikers could benefit from such systematic approaches. They tend to rely on brute strength rather than technique, which leads to exhaustion and poor decision-making." The trail gradually steepened as they climbed higher, and Rebecca began to feel the effects of the thin mountain air. Her breathing deepened, but she maintained steady progress by adjusting her pace and using the walking stick more deliberately for support and balance. Daniel Sullivan, hiking directly behind Rebecca, offered quiet encouragement and occasional technical advice about foot placement or rest stops. His support was subtle enough to avoid drawing attention to any difficulties she might be experiencing while ensuring she had access to guidance when needed. "Excellent technique for navigating loose rock sections," he murmured as Rebecca carefully picked her way across a patch of unstable terrain. "You're reading the ground conditions very well." After an hour of steady climbing, the group reached a scenic overlook where James called for a rest stop. Rebecca was breathing hard from the exertion and altitude, but she had maintained pace with the group and shown no signs of the kind of difficulties James had clearly expected. "How are you feeling, Miss Hayes?" Colonel Morrison asked as they enjoyed the spectacular view of valleys and peaks stretching to the horizon. "The altitude can be challenging for people unaccustomed to mountain conditions. I'm definitely feeling the thin air, but nothing unmanageable. The systematic pacing Daniel suggested has helped me maintain steady progress without overexertion." Rebecca took a careful sip from her water bottle, aware that hydration management was crucial at altitude. James Sullivan checked his pocket watch and studied the trail ahead. "This is where Colonel Morrison's group will turn back toward town. Miss Hayes and I will continue up to Eagle's Nest Lake, which involves steeper terrain and more challenging navigation." Colonel Morrison dismounted and approached Rebecca with an expression of obvious approval. "Miss Hayes, I've been impressed with your performance this morning. Your technique is sound, your endurance appears adequate. And your attitude is exactly what I want to see in expedition support staff." Rebecca felt a surge of relief and pride at the colonel's assessment. "Thank you, sir. I'm grateful for the opportunity to demonstrate my capabilities under actual field conditions." "James," Colonel Morrison addressed the guide service owner directly, "I see no reason why Miss Hayes shouldn't be included in our hunting expedition next week. Her performance today suggests she'll be a valuable addition to your team." James nodded reluctantly, clearly unable to argue with his most important client's assessment. "If Miss Hayes completes today's trial successfully, we'll discuss permanent employment arrangements." After Colonel Morrison's group departed for town, Rebecca and James continued up the increasingly steep trail toward Eagle's Nest Lake. The terrain became more challenging, requiring careful navigation around rock obstacles and across creek crossings where the prosthetic leg's limitations became more apparent. "Watch your footing here," James warned as they approached a particularly tricky stream crossing. "The rocks are slippery, and a fall could be serious this far from medical assistance." Rebecca studied the crossing carefully, identifying the safest route and planning her movements to accommodate her prosthetic leg's reduced flexibility. She used the walking stick to test each foothold before committing her weight, taking longer than James, but successfully navigating the obstacle without incident. "Good problem-solving approach," James acknowledged grudgingly. "Taking extra time for difficult sections shows good judgment." The afternoon brought new challenges as they climbed above the tree line into terrain where weather conditions could change rapidly. Rebecca learned to read cloud formations and wind patterns that might indicate approaching storms, while also managing the physical demands of high-altitude hiking with increasingly steep grades. "Altitude affects everyone differently," James explained as they took another rest break beside a small alpine meadow. "Some people adapt quickly, others struggle with headaches and nausea. How are you handling the elevation gain?" "I'm definitely working harder than usual, but no significant discomfort beyond normal exertion fatigue," Rebecca replied honestly. The systematic pacing and regular rest stops seemed to be effective for managing the altitude transition. James nodded approvingly. "Good self-assessment. Recognizing your limits and managing them appropriately is crucial for mountain safety. Too many people push beyond their capabilities and create dangerous situations." Eagle's Nest Lake appeared suddenly as they crested a rocky ridge, its crystal-clear water reflecting the surrounding peaks like a perfect mirror. The alpine setting was breathtakingly beautiful, but Rebecca immediately understood why James had chosen this location for her trial. The terrain around the lake was challenging enough to test her abilities thoroughly. "We'll camp on that flat area near the outlet stream." James pointed to a spot that looked ideal for tents, but required careful navigation across loose rock and steep slopes. Setting up camp efficiently is as important as hiking ability for expedition work. Rebecca studied the campsite location, already planning her movements and equipment handling to compensate for her prosthetic leg's limitations. The challenge would be maintaining balance while carrying gear across uneven terrain. But the principles were similar to tasks she had mastered in Philadelphia. "I'll take the lighter, bulkier items first to establish safe routes, then make additional trips for heavier equipment," she suggested. "Multiple trips with good balance are safer than single trips with unstable loads." "Exactly the right approach," James agreed, his approval becoming more genuine as Rebecca demonstrated practical understanding of mountain safety principles. "Most people want to carry everything at once and end up creating hazardous situations." Setting up camp proved to be an excellent test of Rebecca's adaptability and problem-solving skills. The tent required careful positioning to avoid both wind exposure and unstable ground, while the cooking area needed protection from weather and access to water without creating environmental damage. Rebecca approached each task systematically, using her walking stick for stability while handling equipment and developing techniques for managing camp duties that accommodated her prosthetic leg's characteristics. James watched her work with growing respect for her practical competence. "Your organization skills are impressive," he commented as Rebecca arranged their gear for easy access while maintaining neat, secure storage. "Most people just pile everything together and then can't find what they need when conditions become difficult. 7 years of managing daily tasks with physical limitations teaches systematic approaches to almost everything," Rebecca replied while starting their campfire with the techniques Daniel had shown her. When you can't rely on brute force or conventional methods, efficiency becomes essential. The evening meal preparation became another opportunity for Rebecca to demonstrate her capabilities. She adapted cooking techniques to work effectively, while seated or kneeling, reducing strain on her prosthetic leg while maintaining excellent results. The simple mountain fare she prepared was flavorful and nutritious, exactly what expedition work required. "This is excellent," James said as they ate beside the crackling fire with Eagle's Nest Lake reflecting the last light of sunset. "Good." Camp cooking is a crucial skill that many guides overlook. Clients expect quality meals even in wilderness conditions. "I enjoy cooking, and I've learned that good food improves everyone's morale and energy during challenging conditions," Rebecca replied. "Proper nutrition is as important as proper equipment for expedition success." As darkness settled over the mountains, James began discussing the technical aspects of guide work that would be essential for Rebecca's success. He explained client management techniques, emergency procedures, equipment maintenance, and the countless details that made the difference between professional and amateur expedition services. "The clients we serve are accustomed to high standards and professional competence," James explained as they prepared for sleep in their respective tents. "They pay premium prices because they expect premium service, regardless of weather conditions or unexpected challenges. I understand the importance of maintaining professional standards under all circumstances," Rebecca assured him. "My experience in Philadelphia taught me that client satisfaction depends on consistent performance, not just good intentions." That night, sleeping in her tent beside Eagle's Nest Lake, Rebecca reflected on the day's accomplishments with deep satisfaction. She had successfully navigated challenging mountain terrain, demonstrated practical competence in camp management, and earned grudging respect from James Sullivan. Despite his initial reluctance about her employment, the prosthetic leg that had seemed like such an insurmountable barrier to acceptance was proving to be the foundation for developing exactly the kind of systematic, safety-conscious approach that mountain work required. Her adaptations and problem-solving techniques were assets rather than accommodations, contributing to expedition effectiveness rather than detracting from it. The second day of the trial expedition brought new challenges as James tested Rebecca's abilities under more demanding conditions. They broke camp efficiently and began exploring the terrain around Eagle's Nest Lake, practicing navigation techniques and emergency procedures that would be essential during actual client expeditions. Emergency response capability is crucial for guide work, James explained as he demonstrated first aid techniques adapted for wilderness conditions. "Clients expect us to handle medical problems, equipment failures, and weather emergencies competently and calmly." Rebecca practiced bandaging techniques, equipment repairs, and emergency shelter construction with the same systematic approach she brought to other tasks. Her experience managing daily challenges with her prosthetic leg had developed exactly the kind of calm problem-solving mentality that emergency situations required. "Your composure under pressure is remarkable," James observed as Rebecca successfully completed a complex first aid scenario he had created. "Many people panic when things don't go according to plan, but you seem to thrive on solving unexpected problems." "Unexpected problems have been part of my daily life for 7 years," Rebecca replied with a smile. "I've learned that panic wastes energy that's better spent finding solutions." The return hike to Pine Ridge provided final opportunities. for James to assess Rebecca's endurance and technical abilities. The descent presented different challenges than the ascent, requiring careful attention to foot placement and weight distribution to avoid falls or injuries. Rebecca's prosthetic leg actually provided advantages during the descent, offering consistent support and stability that tired natural legs might not maintain. Her systematic approach to navigation and her careful attention to safety principles impressed James throughout the return journey. "Miss Hayes," James said as Pine Ridge came into view below them, "I owe you an apology for my initial doubts about your suitability for guide work. Your performance over the past 2 days has been exemplary." Rebecca felt overwhelming relief and pride at this acknowledgement. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. I hope this trial has demonstrated that physical challenges can become assets when approached with proper preparation and determination." "Indeed it has. If you're willing to accept the position, I'd like to offer you permanent employment with the guide service, starting with Colonel Morrison's hunting expedition next week." As they walked into Pine Ridge together, Rebecca realized that she had achieved something she had barely dared hope for when leaving Philadelphia. She had not only found employment, but had earned respect and acceptance based on her actual capabilities rather than others' assumptions about her limitations. The mountains surrounding Pine Ridge no longer seemed intimidating or foreign. They had become her proving ground and would soon become her workplace, offering opportunities to build a life based on her strengths, rather than being defined by society's perceptions of her disability. Rebecca Hayes had successfully transformed herself from rejected mail-order bride to respected mountain guide, proving that determination and adaptability could overcome any obstacle that circumstances might present. The hunting expedition into the high country began under perfect conditions, with crystal-clear skies and crisp October air that made every distant peak stand out in sharp relief. Rebecca had spent 3 days preparing equipment and supplies under James Sullivan's exacting standards, her confidence growing with each task she mastered efficiently. Colonel Morrison's hunting party consisted of 5 men total: the colonel himself, his business associate Harrison Blackwood, a young journalist named Timothy Fletcher, who was documenting the expedition for an Eastern magazine, and 2 additional clients from Chicago, who had paid substantial fees for the privilege of hunting elk in Colorado's remote wilderness. Rebecca's responsibilities encompassed everything from meal preparation and camp maintenance to equipment management and basic medical support. Her systematic approach to organization had already impressed the clients during their preliminary meetings in Pine Ridge, where her detailed supply lists and efficient packing methods had demonstrated professional competence that transcended any concerns about her prosthetic leg. "Miss Hayes has thought of everything," Colonel Morrison had observed approvingly as Rebecca demonstrated her camp kitchen setup and emergency medical supplies. "Her attention to detail reminds me of the best military quartermasters I worked with during the war." The expedition's first 3 days proceeded flawlessly as the group traveled deeper into the mountains, following game trails and established routes that James knew intimately. Rebecca's camp management proved exemplary. Meals were prepared efficiently and served hot despite challenging conditions. Equipment remained organized and accessible, and her morning routine had the camps broken down and packed with military precision. More importantly, Rebecca had begun to establish genuine rapport with the clients, who appreciated her professionalism and competence. Timothy Fletcher, the journalist, was particularly fascinated by her adaptive techniques and had asked permission to include observations about her methods in his magazine article. "You've revolutionized camp efficiency," Timothy told Rebecca, as she prepared breakfast on their 4th morning. "Your systematic approaches to cooking and equipment management are far superior to anything I've observed during previous expeditions. Would you mind if I documented some of your innovations for publication? I'd be honored to have my techniques shared if they might help other guides improve their services." Rebecca replied while simultaneously managing multiple cooking tasks with practiced coordination. Most of what I do is simply applying problem solving. Principles I learned through adapting to my prosthetic leg. Harrison Blackwood, initially skeptical about including a woman with a disability in the expedition, had become one of Rebecca's strongest supporters after witnessing her capabilities firsthand. "Miss Hayes, your performance has exceeded all expectations. James Sullivan is fortunate to have recruited someone with your skills and dedication." The crisis that would test everyone's limits began developing on the expedition's fourth evening, though none of them recognized the warning signs initially. The weather had remained stable throughout their journey, but experienced mountain guides knew that October conditions could change rapidly and dramatically in the high country. James Sullivan studied the western sky with growing concern as Rebecca prepared dinner for the group. Thin, high clouds were moving in from the Pacific, and the wind pattern suggested a major storm system approaching faster than weather predictions had indicated. "Miss Hayes," James said quietly, pulling her aside while the clients discussed their hunting plans for the following day, "I don't like the look of those clouds. We may need to implement emergency procedures if this weather deteriorates as quickly as I think it might." Rebecca glanced at the darkening sky, noting the subtle changes in air pressure and temperature that her heightened sensitivity to environmental conditions had taught her to recognize. "What kind of timeline are we looking at, and what preparations should I prioritize? If I'm reading the signs correctly, we could have serious snow and wind by tomorrow afternoon. The question is whether we try to descend immediately or hunker down here and wait for the storm to pass." James studied their current campsite, evaluating its protection from wind and accessibility for emergency evacuation if necessary. "What are the advantages and disadvantages of each option?" Rebecca asked, recognizing that her input might be valuable for such crucial decisions. Descending immediately would get us to lower elevations where the storm impact would be less severe, but we'd be traveling through increasingly dangerous conditions as the weather deteriorated. Staying here gives us better shelter in known terrain, but we could be trapped for several days if the storm is as severe as I suspect. Rebecca considered the implications of both choices, thinking through the logistical challenges each option would present. From a supply and equipment perspective, how long could we maintain the group comfortably if we remain in place? With careful rationing, probably 5 or 6 days. The bigger concern would be keeping everyone warm and dry if we get heavy snow and high winds. James gestured toward their current campsite, which offered good protection from prevailing winds, but limited options for expansion or improved shelter. That night, the temperature dropped more rapidly than anyone had anticipated, and Rebecca woke before dawn to find frost covering everything outside the tents. More ominously, the wind had shifted to come from the north, bringing the smell of snow and the kind of penetrating cold that indicated a major storm system. James emerged from his tent at first light, his expression grim as he assessed the rapidly changing conditions. "We're getting out of here immediately," he announced to the group. "Everyone pack essential gear, only we need to start descending within the hour." The next several hours became a test of everyone's endurance and determination as they attempted to descend through increasingly treacherous conditions. The snow began falling heavily by mid-morning, reducing visibility and making the already challenging terrain genuinely dangerous. Rebecca found herself facing the most demanding physical test of her life as she struggled to maintain footing on steep, snow-covered slopes while carrying essential supplies. Her prosthetic leg, which had performed admirably under normal conditions, began to present serious challenges as snow and ice accumulated around the joints and attachment points. "Miss Hayes, are you managing all right?" Daniel Sullivan, who had joined the expedition as an additional guide, stayed close to Rebecca as the group navigated particularly treacherous sections of trail. "The prosthetic is collecting ice, which affects my balance and stability. Rebecca replied honestly, recognizing that false confidence could endanger the entire group. I'm managing for now, but the conditions are definitely pushing my capabilities. Daniel immediately understood the implications. Let's modify your pack distribution and adjust the descent route to give you better footing options. We can't afford to have anyone struggling unnecessarily in these conditions. The storm intensified throughout the morning, transforming their planned descent into a desperate fight for survival. Visibility dropped to mere yards, the wind increased to dangerous levels, and the accumulating snow made every step treacherous for the entire group. By noon, it became clear that continuing the descent was no longer possible safely. James made the difficult decision to seek emergency shelter, rather than risk the group becoming lost or injured in the worsening blizzard. There's an old mining cabin about half a mile east of here, James shouted over the howling wind. If we can reach it, we'll have solid shelter until this storm passes. Everyone stay close together. If someone gets separated in this visibility, we might not find them again. The half-mile journey to the mining cabin became an epic struggle against conditions that seemed determined to defeat them. Rebecca pushed her prosthetic leg beyond its normal limits, fighting through snow that reached above her knees while maintaining the pace necessary to keep the group together. Timothy Fletcher, the journalist, began showing signs of altitude sickness and exhaustion that threatened to slow the entire group's progress. Rebecca immediately recognized the symptoms and took action to support him, without drawing attention to his struggles in ways that might damage his pride. Mr. Fletcher, would you mind carrying my walking stick for a while? She asked casually, knowing that the stick would provide him with additional stability without making his need for assistance obvious. I'm finding it more of a hindrance than a help in these deep snow conditions. The journalist accepted the walking stick gratefully, not realizing that Rebecca was sacrificing her own stability to help him maintain his footing. The gesture exemplified the kind of selfless problem-solving that emergency situations required, putting group welfare ahead of individual concerns. Harrison Blackwood also began struggling with the demanding conditions, his expensive equipment and clothing proving inadequate for the severity of the storm they were experiencing. Rebecca quickly identified solutions that would help him without embarrassing him in front of his business associates. Mr. Blackwood, I have extra hand warmers that work better than gloves in these wind conditions, she offered while redistributing supplies to help him stay warm. The chemical heat packets are specifically designed for emergency situations like this. The mining cabin, when they finally reached it, proved to be a partially collapsed structure that offered shelter from the wind, but little protection from cold and moisture. Rebecca immediately assessed their situation and began implementing survival strategies she had never imagined she would need. We need to create insulated sleeping areas and organize our supplies for potentially several days of confinement, she told James as they surveyed their emergency shelter. The cabin provides wind protection, but we'll need to improvise heating and cooking arrangements. Working together, the group managed to create a livable space within the damaged cabin using tarps, sleeping bags, and emergency supplies. Rebecca's organizational skills proved crucial for establishing systems that would sustain 8 people through an extended emergency situation. The storm raged for 3 days, testing everyone's physical and mental endurance, while Rebecca's leadership in managing their survival became increasingly apparent. She rationed food supplies carefully, maintained cooking and heating systems under impossible conditions, and kept group morale positive through her own unwavering determination. Miss Hayes, Colonel Morrison said on their second night in the cabin, your management of this emergency has been extraordinary. You've kept us fed, warm, and organized under conditions that would challenge professional survival experts. Everyone has contributed essential skills, Rebecca replied diplomatically, though privately she knew that her systematic approach to problem-solving had been crucial for their survival. Emergency situations require teamwork and mutual support rather than individual heroics. Timothy Fletcher had been documenting their survival experience, recognizing that Rebecca's leadership was becoming the central story of their ordeal. Miss Hayes, your performance during this crisis has demonstrated capabilities that go far beyond typical guide services. You're managing complex logistics and group dynamics under extreme pressure with remarkable competence. The crisis deepened. On their third day, when Harrison Blackwood developed symptoms of what appeared to be pneumonia, creating a medical emergency that threatened his life and complicated their survival situation. Rebecca's basic medical training, combined with her systematic approach to problem solving, became crucial for managing this additional challenge. We need to keep him warm, monitor his breathing, and administer what medical support we can with our available supplies, Rebecca told James as they assessed Blackwood's deteriorating condition. If his symptoms worsen significantly, we may need to attempt evacuation despite the weather conditions. Rebecca organized around-the-clock care for Blackwood while maintaining all the other survival systems that kept the group functioning. Her ability to manage multiple complex challenges simultaneously impressed everyone and demonstrated leadership capabilities that transcended her original role as camp support staff. You're performing at the level of an expedition leader, James observed as Rebecca coordinated medical care while simultaneously managing food preparation and heating systems. Your crisis management skills are exceptional. The storm finally began clearing on their fourth morning, revealing a transformed landscape of deep snow and challenging travel conditions. The group faced the prospect of a difficult evacuation with an ill team member and limited supplies remaining. Rebecca took charge of planning their evacuation strategy, considering the physical limitations of their group, the available supplies, and the challenging terrain they would need to navigate. Her systematic approach to complex problem solving proved essential for organizing a safe descent under dangerous conditions. We'll need to create an improvised stretcher for Mr. Blackwood and organize our remaining supplies for maximum efficiency, she explained to the group. The descent will be slow and demanding, but we can manage it safely if everyone follows proper procedures. The evacuation became another test of Rebecca's leadership and the group's ability to work together under pressure. Her prosthetic leg, which had seemed like a potential liability at the beginning of the crisis, had actually contributed to her systematic approach to movement and safety that proved valuable for managing the group's descent. Miss Hayes has been the real leader of this expedition, Colonel Morrison told James privately as they prepared for the final descent to Pine Ridge. Her performance during this emergency has been remarkable, professional, competent, and inspiring. The group reached Pine Ridge safely after 2 more days of challenging travel, with Harrison Blackwood recovering steadily under Rebecca's continued medical care. The survival story quickly spread throughout the territory, establishing Rebecca's reputation as someone whose capabilities extended far beyond typical guide service support. Timothy Fletcher's magazine article about the expedition would later be published with the title, "The Guide Who Saved Us All," focusing on Rebecca's leadership during the crisis and her innovative approaches to mountain survival. The article would bring national attention to her work and establish her as a recognized expert in wilderness emergency management. But for Rebecca, standing in Pine Ridge after the most challenging experience of her life, the most important outcome was the recognition that she had discovered capabilities within herself that she had never imagined possessing. The crisis had revealed leadership abilities and problem-solving skills that transformed her understanding of her own potential. James Sullivan approached Rebecca as the expedition members dispersed to recover from their ordeal. "Miss Hayes, I owe you more than an apology for my initial doubts. You saved this expedition and possibly saved lives through your leadership during the emergency. I'd like to discuss expanding your role with the guide service significantly." Rebecca felt overwhelming. Pride and satisfaction as she realized how completely her circumstances had changed. The woman who had arrived in Pine Ridge as a desperate job seeker had become a recognized leader whose skills were valued and respected by everyone who had witnessed her performance. The prosthetic leg that had once seemed like an insurmountable barrier to acceptance had become the foundation for developing exactly the kind of systematic, safety-focused approach that emergency leadership required. Her adaptations and problem-solving techniques had proven to be assets rather than limitations, contributing to everyone's survival and establishing her reputation as someone whose capabilities transcended conventional expectations. As Rebecca prepared for whatever opportunities lay ahead, she understood that the crisis had transformed not just others' perceptions of her abilities, but her own understanding of what she might be capable of achieving. The mountains had tested her completely, and she had not merely survived, she had excelled beyond anyone's expectations, including her own. News of Rebecca's heroic leadership during the blizzard emergency spread through Pine Ridge like wildfire, transforming her from an unknown newcomer into the town's most celebrated resident within days of the expedition's return. Timothy Fletcher's preliminary accounts, shared while waiting for telegraph services to resume after the storm, painted such a compelling picture of her crisis management that the local newspaper editor requested an immediate interview. Miss Hayes, editor William Crenshaw of the Pine Ridge Herald began as he settled into the chair across from Rebecca in Henderson's general store. The entire territory is talking about your performance during the Morrison expedition. Could you describe how you approached the emergency management that ultimately saved everyone's lives? Rebecca shifted uncomfortably under the attention, still adjusting to being viewed as a hero rather than someone requiring accommodation for her disability. Mr. Crenshaw, I simply applied problem-solving principles I've developed through years of adapting to challenges. Emergency situations require systematic thinking and coordinated teamwork rather than individual heroics. But according to Colonel Morrison's account, you took charge of survival operations that sustained 8 people through 4 days of life-threatening conditions. That demonstrates leadership capabilities far beyond basic problem-solving. Editor Crenshaw's excitement about the story was obvious as he scribbled notes in his worn leather journal. The interview continued for over an hour, with Rebecca reluctantly providing details about the crisis management techniques she had developed instinctively during their ordeal. Her systematic approach to resource allocation, group coordination, and morale maintenance had indeed been crucial for their survival. Though she remained modest about her contributions, word of Rebecca's achievements reached Denver within a week, carried by telegraph messages and traveling businessmen who had heard the dramatic survival story. The territorial capital's newspapers picked up the account, with headlines like "Mountain Heroine Saves Expedition" and "One-Legged Woman Leads Survival Miracle," that made Rebecca cringe with their emphasis on her disability rather than her capabilities. More significantly, Rebecca's story attracted attention from Dr. Margaret Whitman, Colorado Territory's only female physician, who traveled to Pine Ridge specifically to meet the woman whose crisis leadership had impressed such experienced outdoorsmen. Dr. Whitman's visit would prove to be a turning point in Rebecca's understanding of her own potential. Miss Hayes, Dr. Whitman began as they sat in the parlor of Henderson's general store, which had become Pine Ridge's unofficial meeting place for important conversations. Your emergency medical management of Mr. Blackwood's pneumonia demonstrates considerable knowledge and skill. Have you considered formal medical training? Rebecca was startled by the suggestion. Dr. Whitman, I have no formal education beyond basic schooling. My medical knowledge comes entirely from necessity and practical experience managing my own condition. Precisely why you might excel in medical training, Dr. Whitman replied firmly. You've developed diagnostic instincts and treatment approaches through direct experience with physical challenges. Many medical students lack the practical understanding of adaptation and problem solving that you've mastered through necessity. The conversation that followed opened possibilities Rebecca had never imagined. Dr. Whitman described correspondence medical programs that would allow Rebecca to study while maintaining her guide service responsibilities, eventually qualifying for territorial medical certification that would make her invaluable in frontier communities lacking adequate health care. The Western Territories desperately need medical practitioners who understand the practical challenges of frontier life. Dr. Whitman explained, "Your combination of crisis management experience and adaptive problem solving could make you exactly the kind of doctor these communities need most." Rebecca felt simultaneously excited and intimidated by the prospect of medical training. The systematic thinking and careful attention to detail that her prosthetic leg had required her to develop were indeed well suited to medical practice, and her experience with physical challenges gave her insights into patient care that conventional training might not provide. "I would need to continue my guide service work to support myself financially," Rebecca said cautiously. "Would it be possible to pursue medical studies while maintaining those responsibilities?" "Absolutely. In fact, your field experience would enhance your medical education considerably. Frontier medicine requires exactly the kind of adaptability and resourcefulness you've already demonstrated." Whitman's enthusiasm was infectious as she outlined a training program that could accommodate Rebecca's unique circumstances. The possibility of medical training represented more than career advancement. It offered a pathway to establishing herself as an indispensable member of Colorado Territory's professional community. Rebecca's disability, which had been viewed as a limitation in Pennsylvania, was increasingly being recognized as the foundation for exactly the skills frontier communities needed most. Jane Sullivan's attitude toward Rebecca had undergone a complete transformation following the expedition crisis. He approached her one morning with a proposal that reflected his newfound respect for her capabilities and his recognition of the business opportunities her reputation was creating. "Miss Hayes," James began as they reviewed equipment inventory in his office behind the stable, "I've been thinking about expanding the guide service to include specialized expeditions that would utilize your particular skills and reputation." Rebecca looked up from the supply list she was organizing, curious about James's evolving vision for the business. "What kind of specialized expeditions did you have in mind?" "Medical and scientific research expeditions, territorial survey teams that need reliable support in challenging conditions, and emergency rescue operations when other groups get into trouble in the mountains." James spread maps across his desk, indicating remote areas where such services would be valuable. "Your crisis management abilities and systematic approach to complex problems make you ideal for coordinating these kinds of specialized operations." The proposal was ambitious and flattering, recognizing Rebecca as a genuine partner rather than just an employee. More importantly, it acknowledged that her disability-driven adaptations had created capabilities that were professionally valuable, rather than personal limitations requiring accommodation. Such expeditions would require significant additional training and equipment investment, Rebecca observed, studying the maps and considering the logistical challenges involved. But they could also establish the guide service as the premier operation in the territory for demanding, high-stakes missions. "Exactly. Your reputation from the Morrison expedition has already generated inquiries from territorial officials and research institutions. They want to hire the guide service specifically because of your involvement." James smiled with genuine pride in his employees' achievements. "You've become our most valuable asset, Miss Hayes." The conversation continued with detailed planning for expanding their services, including provisions for Rebecca's potential medical training and the integration of healthcare capabilities into their expedition offerings. The partnership James was proposing would make Rebecca an equal stakeholder in a growing business rather than just an employee working for wages. Rebecca's growing prominence in Pine Ridge's community extended beyond her professional achievements. to include social recognition that she had never experienced before. The town's leading families began inviting her to dinners and social gatherings, treating her as an honored guest rather than someone requiring charitable accommodation. Mrs. Sarah Henderson, the general store owner's wife and Pine Ridge's unofficial social coordinator, approached Rebecca with an invitation that demonstrated how completely her status in the community had changed. Miss Hayes, we're organizing a ladies' auxiliary to support the territorial medical mission, and we'd be honored to have you serve as our founding president. Rebecca was touched by the recognition implicit in the invitation. Mrs. Henderson, I'm flattered by your confidence, but wouldn't someone with more established social connections be better suited for such a leadership role? Miss Hayes, your organizational abilities and understanding of medical needs make you the obvious choice for leading our auxiliary efforts. Mrs. Henderson replied firmly. The women of Pine Ridge want someone who can make a real difference, rather than just organize tea parties and charity drives. The medical auxiliary represented another opportunity for Rebecca to contribute meaningfully to her community while developing skills and connections that would support her long-term goals. The organizational and leadership experience would complement her guide service work and potential medical training perfectly. Rebecca's social integration accelerated when Dr. Whitman returned to Pine Ridge with medical textbooks and study materials for Rebecca's preliminary training. The sight of the territory's most respected female physician treating Rebecca as a professional colleague elevated her status even further in the community's estimation. Miss Hayes is studying to become a certified medical practitioner, Dr. Whitman announced during a public meeting about territorial healthcare needs. Her combination of practical experience and systematic problem-solving makes her ideally suited for frontier medical practice. The announcement generated excitement throughout Pine Ridge, where residents recognized the value of having a medically trained professional available for emergencies. Rebecca's prosthetic leg, once viewed as a limitation, was increasingly being seen as evidence of the kind of adaptability that frontier medical practice required. Daniel Sullivan had been watching Rebecca's social and professional transformation with growing admiration that was beginning to develop into deeper feelings. His initial support for giving her a chance had evolved into genuine respect for her capabilities, and recently into romantic interest that he was struggling to express appropriately. Rebecca, Daniel said one evening as they walked along Pine Ridge's main street after a community meeting, using her first name for the first time. I hope you don't mind me saying that watching your success here has been remarkable. You've accomplished more in a few months than most people achieve in years. Rebecca felt a flutter of awareness at Daniel's change in tone and the personal nature of his comment. Thank you, Daniel. Your support from the very beginning made everything possible. I'll always be grateful for your willingness to give me a chance when your uncle was reluctant. It's been more than just giving you a chance, Daniel continued. Carefully, I've come to admire not just your professional capabilities, but your character and determination. You've faced every challenge with grace and competence that I find inspiring. The conversation was taking a distinctly personal direction that both excited and concerned Rebecca. Her focus had been so completely on establishing her professional credentials that she hadn't seriously considered romantic possibilities, despite her growing fondness for Daniel's consistent support and genuine character. Daniel, I appreciate your kind words more than I can express, Rebecca replied thoughtfully. Your friendship and support have meant everything to me during this transition. I hope you understand that my focus has necessarily been on establishing my professional standing rather than considering personal relationships. I understand completely, Daniel assured her quickly. I'm not trying to pressure you or complicate your situation. I just wanted you to know that my admiration extends beyond professional respect to genuine personal affection, should you ever be interested in exploring such possibilities. Rebecca felt her heart racing at Daniel's honest declaration of his feelings. The possibility of a romantic relationship with someone who had seen her at her worst and still admired her capabilities was both thrilling and terrifying. Her experience with rejection had made her cautious about emotional vulnerability, even with someone as consistently supportive as Daniel. "Daniel, I need you to know that my prosthetic leg has been a barrier to personal relationships throughout my adult life," Rebecca said honestly. "Men who seemed accepting in theory often proved uncomfortable with the practical realities of my disability when romantic relationships became serious. Rebecca, your prosthetic leg is simply one characteristic among many that make you who you are," Daniel replied with quiet sincerity. "I've watched you handle challenges that would defeat most people, seen your kindness toward others, and admired your determination to build a meaningful life despite obstacles. Those qualities matter far more to me than any physical characteristics." The conversation continued as they walked through Pine Ridge's quiet evening streets, with Rebecca gradually opening up about her fears and hopes regarding personal relationships. Daniel's patient, understanding responses reinforced her growing belief that he might indeed be different from the men who had rejected her in the past. "I'm not asking for any commitments or immediate decisions," Daniel said as they reached the boarding house where Rebecca had taken permanent residence. "I simply want you to know that when you're ready to consider personal relationships, I would be honored to be considered as a possibility." Rebecca's integration into Pine Ridge's social fabric accelerated further when Colonel Morrison returned to town with associates from Denver who were interested in investing in the expanded guide service. The business meeting, held in Henderson's general store, became an informal celebration of Rebecca's achievements and the opportunities they were creating for the entire community. "Gentlemen," Colonel Morrison addressed the gathering of local business leaders and Denver investors, "Miss Hayes represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking and professional competence that will drive territorial development. Her reputation for crisis management and systematic problem-solving has already attracted attention from government agencies and research institutions." The Denver investors were particularly impressed with Rebecca's combination of practical experience and expanding professional credentials. Her ongoing medical studies, leadership of the Ladies' Auxiliary, and partnership in the guide service demonstrated versatility and ambition that appealed to forward-thinking businessmen. "Miss Hayes," said Jonathan Stewart, a prominent Denver businessman, "we're prepared to invest significantly in expanding your guide service operations, particularly if you're willing to consider establishing satellite operations in other territorial communities. Your methods and reputation could be valuable throughout Colorado." The investment proposal represented validation of Rebecca's professional worth that exceeded her wildest dreams when she had first arrived in Pine Ridge. More importantly, it offered opportunities to establish herself as a territorial leader whose influence would extend far beyond local community recognition. Rebecca's evening discussions with Daniel began including detailed planning for their potential future together, both professionally and personally. His mechanical skills and business experience complemented her organizational abilities and growing medical knowledge perfectly, suggesting partnership possibilities that extended beyond romance. "We could establish medical and rescue services throughout the territory," Daniel suggested as they reviewed maps and business projections in James's office. "Your medical training combined with our guide service experience could create something unprecedented in frontier healthcare delivery. The territorial government would certainly support such services," Rebecca agreed, warming to the possibilities. "Dr. Whitman has mentioned that official medical positions might become available for qualified practitioners willing to serve remote communities." Their conversations were becoming increasingly intimate as Rebecca's confidence in Daniel's genuine acceptance of her disability grew stronger. His consistent focus on her capabilities and potential rather than her limitations was gradually overcoming years of defensive caution about romantic relationships. The winter social season in Pine Ridge brought new opportunities for Rebecca to establish herself as a community leader while exploring her developing relationship with Daniel. The combination of professional success, social recognition, and personal happiness was creating a life far richer than anything she had imagined possible when leaving Philadelphia. Rebecca's transformation from desperate job seeker to respected community leader was becoming complete, but more importantly, she was discovering that her prosthetic leg had never been the limitation she had believed it to be. Instead, it had been the catalyst for developing exactly the skills and perspectives that frontier communities valued most. As winter settled over Pine Ridge, Rebecca found herself planning not just for expanded business operations and medical certification, but for a future that might include the kind of personal happiness she had stopped believing was possible. Daniel's patient courtship and genuine appreciation for her complete self were slowly convincing her that love and acceptance might indeed be achievable for someone whose differences had become strengths rather than limitations. The community that had initially seemed like a refuge was becoming home, and the relationships she was building were based on mutual respect and shared goals, rather than charity or accommodation. Rebecca Hayes was finally discovering what it meant to be valued for who she truly was, rather than being defined by others' perceptions of what she lacked. Spring arrived in Pine Ridge with an explosion of wildflowers and possibilities that seemed to mirror Rebecca's blossoming career prospects. Timothy Fletcher's magazine article about the blizzard rescue had been published in Harper's Weekly, creating a sensation that brought Rebecca national attention she never could have anticipated. The Guy Who Saved Us All featured detailed illustrations of Rebecca managing the emergency shelter and leading the group to safety, though she noticed with some irritation that the artist had chosen to emphasize her prosthetic leg rather than her professional competence. Despite the unfortunate focus on her disability, the article generated an overwhelming response from readers across the country. Letters began arriving at Pine Ridge's small post office in such quantities that Postmaster Henry Walsh had to hire additional help to handle the volume. Some correspondents offered business opportunities. Others requested advice about adaptive techniques for various disabilities. And many simply expressed admiration for Rebecca's achievements under impossible circumstances. "Miss Hayes, Postmaster," Walsh said as he delivered another heavy bag of mail to Henderson's General Store, "I've been running this post office for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like the response your story has generated. You're receiving more mail than the rest of Pine Ridge combined." Rebecca felt both gratitude and bewilderment at the national attention. "Mr. Walsh, I simply did what the situation required. I'm amazed that people find it so remarkable." "Perhaps that's exactly why they find it remarkable," suggested Mrs. Henderson, who had been listening to their conversation while organizing the medical auxiliary's latest supply shipment. "Most people assume that someone with your challenges couldn't possibly handle such responsibilities, let alone excel at them." Among the most significant correspondences was a formal letter from the United States Geological Survey, requesting Rebecca's services for a major territorial mapping expedition that would require months of travel through Colorado's most remote regions. The survey team needed someone with proven crisis management abilities and systematic organizational skills for coordinating complex logistics under challenging conditions. "Miss Hayes," the letter read, "your reputation for emergency leadership and adaptive problem-solving has reached our offices in Washington. We would like to engage your services as expedition coordinator for our comprehensive survey of Colorado Territory's mineral and geological resources. This position would involve significant responsibility and compensation commensurate with your demonstrated capabilities." The federal appointment represented validation at the highest levels of government, acknowledging Rebecca as a professional whose skills were valued by national institutions rather than just local communities. More importantly, it offered opportunities to influence territorial development policies that would affect thousands of future settlers, Rebecca discussed the geological survey opportunity with Daniel during their evening walks, which had become a cherished routine that strengthened their relationship while providing privacy for important conversations. Daniel's enthusiasm for her professional advancement was genuine and unselfish, reinforcing her growing confidence in his character. "Rebecca, this appointment could establish you as one of the most influential people in Colorado Territory," Daniel said as they paused beside the creek that ran through Pine Ridge's center. "Your recommendations about resource development and settlement patterns could shape the region's future for decades." "The responsibility is somewhat overwhelming," Rebecca admitted, watching the water cascade over smooth stones in the moonlight. "I'm honored by their confidence, but I'm also aware that my decisions could affect countless people's lives and livelihoods." "Which is exactly why you're the right person for such responsibility," Daniel replied with quiet conviction. "You've consistently demonstrated that you consider consequences carefully and prioritize community welfare over personal advantage. Those qualities are rare in territorial politics." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Margaret Whitman, who had returned to Pine Ridge with news that would complicate Rebecca's decision about the geological survey position. Dr. Whitman's excitement was obvious as she approached them near the creek. "Rebecca, I have extraordinary news," Dr. Whitman announced without preamble. "The Territorial Medical Board has approved your application for accelerated certification, based on your practical experience and emergency medical performance. You could be practicing as a licensed physician within 6 months." Rebecca felt her heart racing at this unexpected development. "Dr. Whitman, I've only been studying for a few months. Surely accelerated certification requires more extensive preparation? Your field experience managing medical emergencies demonstrates competence that many formally trained physicians lack," Dr. Whitman explained enthusiastically. "The board recognizes that frontier medical practice requires exactly the kind of adaptive thinking and crisis management abilities you've already proven you possess." The prospect of becoming a licensed physician represented the culmination of possibilities Rebecca had never dared imagine when leaving Philadelphia. More importantly, it offered the chance to establish herself as an indispensable professional whose services would be valued, regardless of any physical characteristics that had once seemed like limitations. The certification would qualify you for appointment as Territorial Medical Officer for remote communities, Dr. Whitman continued. "Such positions carry significant authority and excellent compensation, while also providing opportunities to establish medical practices wherever you choose to settle permanently." Rebecca found herself facing multiple opportunities that would require difficult choices about her future direction. The geological survey appointment, medical certification, and expanding guide service partnership all offered different pathways to professional success and territorial influence. Daniel sensed her internal conflict and offered support without pressure. "Rebecca, whatever direction you choose, I want you to know that I support your professional ambitions completely. Your success and happiness matter more to me than any personal considerations." His selfless attitude strengthened Rebecca's growing belief that Daniel might indeed be the partner she had stopped hoping to find. Unlike the men who had rejected her in Philadelphia, Daniel consistently demonstrated that he valued her achievements and supported her independence rather than being threatened by her capabilities. The Federal Geological Survey team arrived in Pine Ridge 2 weeks later, led by Chief Surveyor Maxwell Richardson, whose reputation for demanding excellence and systematic thoroughness had made him legendary within government scientific circles. Richardson's first meeting with Rebecca would determine whether she received the expedition coordinator appointment. "Miss Hayes," Richardson began as they met in James Sullivan's office, which had become Pine Ridge's unofficial headquarters for important business discussions, "your reputation for crisis management has reached impressive heights, but I need to assess your qualifications for coordinating complex scientific operations under field conditions." Rebecca appreciated his direct approach, which focused on professional capabilities rather than expressing surprise about her disability. "Mr. Richardson, I'd welcome the opportunity to demonstrate my organizational and logistical coordination abilities under whatever assessment conditions you consider appropriate." Excellent attitude. "I've prepared a series of scenarios that will test your problem-solving approaches, resource management skills, and ability to coordinate multiple objectives simultaneously." Richardson spread maps and equipment lists across the table. "These exercises simulate the kinds of challenges you would face as expedition coordinator for our territorial survey." The assessment continued for 3 hours, with Richardson presenting increasingly complex logistical problems that required systematic solutions and creative adaptations. Rebecca's performance exceeded his expectations as she demonstrated the kind of methodical thinking and comprehensive planning that large-scale expeditions required. "Remarkable," Richardson murmured as Rebecca completed her analysis of a particularly challenging supply distribution scenario. "Your systematic approach to complex problems is exactly what scientific expeditions need. Most coordinators rely on improvisation rather than comprehensive planning. I've learned that systematic preparation prevents most emergency situations," Rebecca replied, organizing her notes with practiced efficiency. "Anticipating potential problems and developing contingency plans reduces crisis management requirements significantly." Richardson's final assessment was unequivocally positive. "Miss Hughes, I'm prepared to offer you the expedition coordinator position with full authority over logistical operations and personnel management. Your analytical abilities and systematic planning approaches are superior to anyone I've worked with previously." The federal appointment carried a salary that exceeded anything Rebecca had imagined possible when leaving Philadelphia, along with opportunities for advancement within government scientific services that could establish her career at national levels. The position represented complete vindication of her decision to seek opportunities in Colorado Territory. News of Rebecca's federal appointment spread through Pine Ridge with the speed of wildfire, generating celebration throughout the community that had watched her remarkable transformation. The town council organized a formal recognition ceremony that acknowledged her achievements, while also celebrating Pine Ridge's role in supporting her success. "Citizens of Pine Ridge," Mayor George Hendricks announced during the ceremony held in the town's new community hall, "we gather tonight to honor Miss Rebecca Hayes, whose achievements have brought recognition to our community, while demonstrating the opportunities available to those willing to work hard and think creatively." The ceremony included presentations from community leaders, testimonials from expedition clients, and reading of congratulatory messages from territorial officials who had followed Rebecca's career. The celebration demonstrated how completely her status had changed from outsider seeking accommodation to respected leader whose success reflected positively on the entire community. Colonel Morrison, who had become one of Rebecca's strongest supporters, delivered remarks that captured the significance of her transformation. Miss Hayes arrived in Pine Ridge carrying nothing but determination and hope. Through her own efforts, she's become one of Colorado Territory's most respected professionals, proving that capability and character matter more than conventional expectations. Dr. Whitman's presentation focused on Rebecca's medical achievements, and the precedent her success was setting for other women with disabilities who sought professional opportunities. Miss Hayes has demonstrated that physical challenges often develop exactly the problem-solving abilities that professional practice requires. Her example will inspire others to pursue opportunities they might otherwise consider impossible. Daniel's remarks were more personal, acknowledging his growing relationship with Rebecca while respecting her independence and professional achievements. Miss Hayes has shown all of us what's possible when someone refuses to be limited by others' expectations. Her success is an inspiration to everyone who believes that determination and hard work can overcome any obstacle. The community celebration concluded with the presentation of a specially commissioned map of Colorado Territory, signed by every Pine Ridge resident, that would accompany Rebecca on her geological survey expeditions. The gesture symbolized the community's pride in her achievements and their ongoing support for her continued success. Rebecca's acceptance speech reflected on her journey, from rejected mail-order bride to federal appointee, acknowledging the support that had made her transformation possible while encouraging others to pursue their own ambitious goals despite apparent limitations. When I arrived in Pine Ridge, I believed my prosthetic leg made me less capable than other people, Rebecca told the assembled crowd. This community taught me that what I had considered a limitation was actually the foundation for developing skills that territorial life requires. I hope my experience encourages others to see challenges as opportunities rather than obstacles. The Federal Geological Survey expedition launched from Pine Ridge in late spring, with Rebecca serving as coordinator for a team of 12 scientists, surveyors, and support staff who would spend the summer mapping Colorado's mineral resources and geological formations. The expedition's success would influence territorial development policies and attract investment that could transform the region's economic prospects. Rebecca's systematic approach to expedition management impressed the scientific team from their first day in the field. Her organizational systems, safety protocols, and resource management techniques created operational efficiency that allowed the scientists to focus on their research rather than worrying about logistical concerns. "Miss Hayes," commented Dr. Samuel Foster, the expedition's chief geologist, "your coordination abilities are remarkable. I've participated in expeditions throughout the Western Territories, and none have operated with this level of organization and efficiency." The expedition's preliminary findings suggested mineral deposits and geological formations that could support extensive mining and agricultural development throughout Colorado Territory. Rebecca's detailed documentation and systematic data organization would be crucial for presenting their discoveries to federal officials and potential investors. More importantly for Rebecca personally, the expedition's success established her reputation within federal scientific circles as someone whose capabilities extended far beyond crisis management to include comprehensive project coordination at the highest professional levels. The recommendations she would receive from the expedition leadership would open doors to opportunities throughout the expanding Western Territories. Daniel's letters reached Rebecca regularly during the expedition, maintaining their relationship while respecting her professional independence. His updates about Pine Ridge's continued growth and development reinforced her connection to the community that had supported her transformation. "Rebecca," Daniel wrote in one particularly meaningful letter, "watching your success from afar fills me with pride and admiration that grows stronger each day. You've exceeded every expectation and created opportunities that will benefit countless others. I eagerly await your return so we can discuss our future together." The Geological Survey expedition concluded in early autumn with findings that would influence territorial policy for decades. Rebecca's coordination had enabled discoveries of coal deposits, mineral veins, and agricultural potential that could support substantial population growth and economic development throughout Colorado. Chief Surveyor Richardson's final report to federal authorities included specific recommendations for Rebecca's advancement within government service. "Miss Hayes demonstrates project management capabilities that qualify her for senior administrative positions within territorial development programs. Her systematic approaches and crisis management abilities make her invaluable for coordinating complex government operations." As Rebecca returned to Pine Ridge after months in the field, she realized that her transformation was entering a new phase. The federal recognition and professional validation she had achieved created opportunities to influence territorial development while also enabling the personal happiness she had stopped believing was possible. The woman who had arrived in Pine Ridge seeking basic employment had become a territorial leader, whose professional capabilities were recognized at national levels. More importantly, she had discovered that her prosthetic leg had never been the limitation she believed it to be, but rather the catalyst for developing exactly the skills that frontier leadership required. Daniel's presence at the train station, when Rebecca returned from the geological survey expedition, symbolized the personal happiness that was now possible alongside her professional success. Their reunion after months of separation confirmed that their relationship had deepened into love, was strong enough to support whatever future they chose to build together. Pine Ridge welcomed Rebecca home with a celebration that acknowledged her national recognition while also expressing the community's continuing pride in her achievements. The town that had given her the chance to prove herself was now benefiting from the reputation and opportunities her success had created. As autumn settled over Colorado territory, Rebecca found herself planning not just for continued professional advancement, but for a future that included the personal fulfillment she had once thought impossible for someone whose differences had become her greatest strengths. The letter arrived on a crisp November morning, exactly 2 years after Rebecca's first desperate arrival in Pine Ridge, but the circumstances of its delivery couldn't have been more different. Instead of standing alone on a train platform with nothing but hope in a small satchel, Rebecca now sat in her own spacious office as the newly appointed territorial medical coordinator, surrounded by maps, correspondence, and evidence of influence that extended throughout Colorado and beyond. "Mrs. Sullivan," said her assistant Martha Fielding, as she placed the morning mail on Rebecca's desk, "there's a letter here from Philadelphia that appears to be personal rather than official business." Rebecca looked up from the territorial healthcare budget she was reviewing, noting Martha's use of her married name with the same quiet satisfaction she had felt every day since her wedding to Daniel 6 months earlier. The ceremony had been Pine Ridge's social event of the year, attended by territorial officials, federal survey colleagues, and community members who had watched her remarkable transformation. The Philadelphia letter was written in an elegant feminine hand on expensive stationery, suggesting educated correspondence rather than another request for employment advice or adaptive technique guidance. Rebecca opened it carefully, curious about who might be writing from the city she had fled in desperation 2 years earlier. "Mrs. Sullivan," the letter began, "you will not remember me, but I am Eleanor Patterson, formerly of Mrs. Patterson's boarding house where you resided briefly before departing for Colorado territory. I am writing to inform you that your extraordinary success has become legendary among the women of Philadelphia who face similar challenges to those you overcame." Rebecca felt a complex mixture of emotions as she read about the boarding house, where she had spent her final desperate days in Philadelphia. Mrs. Patterson's establishment had been her last refuge before risking everything on James Sullivan's advertisement. And now Eleanor Patterson was describing how Rebecca's story had inspired other women to pursue opportunities they had never imagined possible. "Your example has encouraged several of our residents to seek opportunities in the Western Territories," Eleanor continued. Young women with various physical challenges who had resigned themselves to dependence on charity have begun corresponding with territorial employers and guide services, using your success as evidence that capability matters more than conventional expectations. The letter included requests for advice about territorial opportunities and adaptive techniques that would help other women navigate the challenges Rebecca had faced. More significantly, it suggested that her transformation from rejected mail-order bride to territorial leader was inspiring systemic changes in how society viewed people with disabilities. Rebecca set the letter aside and walked to her office window, which offered spectacular views of the Colorado peaks that had become so familiar and welcoming. The mountains that had once seemed impossibly intimidating now represented home, opportunity, and the foundation of everything she had achieved. Knock at her office door interrupted her reflections. Daniel entered carrying architectural drawings and the enthusiasm that characterized his approach to their latest collaborative project, establishing Colorado Territory's first comprehensive medical training center that would incorporate adaptive techniques and inclusive design principles Rebecca had pioneered. "Rebecca, the territorial legislature has approved our funding proposal," Daniel announced with obvious excitement. "The Medical Training Center will receive full territorial support, including land grants and construction funding, that will make this the most advanced facility west of the Mississippi." The Medical Training Center represented the culmination of Rebecca's vision for addressing territorial healthcare needs through innovative approaches that valued practical experience alongside formal education. The facility would train physicians, nurses, and medical support staff using methods that emphasized adaptive problem-solving and crisis management skills. "The legislature was particularly impressed with your proposal for training programs specifically designed for people with various physical challenges," Daniel continued, spreading the architectural drawings across Rebecca's desk. "They recognize that your success demonstrates untapped potential in populations that conventional medical education typically excludes." Rebecca studied the building plans, noting features that would accommodate students and patients with diverse physical characteristics, while maintaining the highest professional standards. The center would serve as a model for inclusive education throughout the expanding Western Territories. "Dr. Whitman has agreed to serve as dean of the medical school," Rebecca said, reviewing correspondence from her mentor and colleague. "Her reputation and connections will attract faculty and students from throughout the country, establishing our program as nationally recognized from its inception." The training center project had attracted attention from medical institutions across the country, many of which were interested in implementing similar inclusive approaches to professional education. Rebecca's systematic methods for accommodating diverse learning needs while maintaining rigorous standards were being studied by educators who recognized their broader applications. A telegram delivery interrupted their planning session, bringing news that would add another dimension to Rebecca's growing influence. The message was from Washington, D.C., signed by the Secretary of the Interior himself. "Mrs. Sullivan." The telegram read, "President Hayes requests your attendance at White House Conference on Territorial Development Policy. Your recommendations regarding inclusive settlement programs and adaptive infrastructure design needed for national expansion. Planning, travel expenses provided. Immediate response requested." Rebecca stared at the telegram in amazement. The prospect of advising the President of the United States on territorial policy represented validation at the highest levels of government, acknowledging her expertise in areas that would influence the development of the entire American West. "Rebecca, this is extraordinary," Daniel said, reading the telegram over her shoulder. "Presidential advisement positions typically go to established politicians or wealthy business leaders, not territorial professionals regardless of their achievements. The invitation specifically mentions inclusive settlement programs and adaptive infrastructure design," Rebecca observed, recognizing that her disability-driven innovations were being valued for their broader applications to territorial development. They want advice about accommodating diverse populations in new settlements. The White House Conference would address policies for encouraging westward expansion, while ensuring that new territories developed in ways that welcomed all capable settlers, regardless of physical characteristics or conventional limitations. Rebecca's experience proving that challenges could become assets was directly relevant to national expansion strategies. "I should accompany you to Washington," Daniel suggested, his protective instincts competing with his pride in Rebecca's achievements. Presidential conferences involve complex political considerations that might benefit from additional support. "Daniel, I appreciate your concern, but this appointment recognizes my individual expertise rather than our partnership," Rebecca replied gently. I need to demonstrate that my capabilities extend to high-level policy advisement, as well as practical problem-solving. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Timothy Fletcher, the journalist whose original article about Rebecca's blizzard rescue had launched her national reputation. Timothy had continued following Rebecca's career, writing periodic updates that chronicled her transformation and its broader implications for territorial development. "Mrs. Sullivan," Timothy said as he entered her office with obvious excitement, "I've just received authorization from Harper's Weekly to write a comprehensive feature about your work establishing inclusive territorial policies. They want to document how your personal experience has influenced government approaches to Western development. The proposed article would examine how Rebecca's systematic approaches to accommodation and adaptation were being incorporated into territorial planning at national levels. Her methods for creating communities that valued diverse capabilities were becoming models for settlement programs throughout the expanding frontier. The article would trace your journey from rejected mail-order bride to presidential advisor," Timothy explained, "but focusing on the policy innovations and community development principles you've created, rather than just the personal transformation story." Rebecca appreciated Timothy's evolved approach to covering her achievements. His early articles had emphasized the inspirational aspects of her success, but his recent work focused on the practical applications of her innovations and their influence on territorial development policies. "I'd welcome such coverage if it helps other communities implement inclusive development principles," Rebecca agreed. "The techniques we've developed in Pine Ridge could benefit settlements throughout the Western Territories if they're properly documented and promoted." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside Rebecca's office as a group of visitors arrived unannounced. The delegation included territorial officials, federal representatives, and several women who appeared to be traveling under official escort. James Sullivan, who had become Pine Ridge's unofficial diplomatic coordinator due to his guide service connections, entered Rebecca's office with barely contained excitement. "Rebecca, you need to meet these ladies immediately. They've traveled from 5 different territories, specifically to consult with you about establishing inclusive settlement programs." The visiting delegation represented communities from Wyoming, Utah, New Mexico, Montana, and Oregon territories, all of which were implementing settlement programs based on principles Rebecca had developed. The women included territorial officials, community leaders, and organizers who were adapting her methods to diverse geographical and cultural conditions. "Mrs. Sullivan," said Catherine Morrison, a territorial representative from Wyoming, "your approaches to inclusive community development have attracted attention throughout the Western Territories. We've traveled here to learn directly from your experience and to invite your consultation for our own settlement programs." The meeting that followed demonstrated how extensively Rebecca's influence had spread beyond Colorado. Each territorial representative described communities that were implementing her systematic approaches to accommodation and adaptation, creating settlements that welcomed diverse populations while maintaining high standards for productivity and self-sufficiency. "Results have exceeded all expectations," reported Sarah Wellington from Oregon Territory. "Communities that actively recruit people with various challenges are showing higher retention rates, more innovative problem solving, and stronger economic development than traditional settlements." Rebecca felt overwhelming pride and amazement as she learned about the widespread implementation of principles she had developed through necessity and practical experience. Her personal struggle to find acceptance had evolved into systematic approaches that were improving opportunities for thousands of settlers throughout the American West. The territorial representatives requested Rebecca's direct consultation for establishing training programs that would teach her methods to community organizers and government officials throughout the expanding frontier. Such programs would systematize the inclusive development approaches she had pioneered while adapting them to diverse local conditions. "Mrs. Sullivan," said Maria Santos from New Mexico Territory. "We would like to establish a formal institute for inclusive community development with you as founding director. This institution would train organizers, develop policies, and coordinate implementation of inclusive settlement programs throughout the Western Territories." The proposal represented an opportunity to institutionalize and expand the influence of principles Rebecca had developed through personal experience. The institute would ensure that her approaches continued evolving and improving while reaching communities she could never visit personally. That evening, as Rebecca and Daniel walked through Pine Ridge's main street, she reflected on the extraordinary distance she had traveled from desperate mail-order bride to nationally recognized policy expert. The town that had given her the chance to prove herself was now the headquarters for territorial development innovations that were influencing settlement patterns across the entire American frontier. "Rebecca," Daniel said as they paused beside the creek where they had shared so many important conversations, "watching your influence expand beyond what either of us imagined has been remarkable. You've proven that individual determination can create changes that benefit entire populations. I think about that desperate woman who stepped off the train 2 years ago," Rebecca replied, watching moonlight dance on the familiar water. She believed her prosthetic leg made her less valuable than other people. "I wish I could tell her that her differences would become the foundation for everything she would achieve." Their conversation was interrupted by approaching footsteps as Eleanor Patterson, the woman who had written from Philadelphia, appeared with several companions. Eleanor had traveled to Colorado to meet Rebecca personally and to bring other women who were seeking similar opportunities for transformation. "Mrs. Sullivan," Eleanor said with obvious emotion, "meeting you in person feels like encountering a legend. Your example has given hope to women throughout the eastern cities who had accepted that their challenges meant limited opportunities." Eleanor's companions included women with various disabilities who had decided to seek opportunities in the Western Territories based on Rebecca's example. Their presence demonstrated that her transformation was inspiring others to pursue possibilities they had never considered achievable. "Ladies," Rebecca addressed the group with warmth and understanding born from her own experience. "The Western Territories offer opportunities for anyone willing to work hard and think creatively. Your challenges have prepared you for exactly the kind of adaptive problem-solving that frontier communities need most." The conversation continued late into the evening as Rebecca shared practical advice about territorial opportunities, while encouraging the women to see their differences as potential assets rather than limitations. Her guidance would prove crucial for their own successful transitions to Western life. A week later, Rebecca departed for Washington, D.C., carrying recommendations and policy proposals that would influence territorial development for decades. Her systematic approaches to inclusive settlement and adaptive infrastructure were being considered for implementation throughout the expanding American frontier. The White House conference exceeded Rebecca's expectations as government officials sought her input on policies that would affect millions of future settlers. Her recommendations for creating communities that valued diverse capabilities while maintaining high productivity standards were incorporated into national expansion strategies. "Mrs. Sullivan," President Rutherford Hayes said during their private meeting, "your work demonstrates that America's strength lies in providing opportunities for all citizens to contribute their unique capabilities. Your policy recommendations will help ensure that territorial expansion creates inclusive communities rather than just replicating Eastern limitations." The presidential recognition represented the ultimate validation of Rebecca's journey from rejected mail-order bride to national policy advisor. More importantly, it ensured that the principles she had developed through personal struggle would influence the development of countless communities throughout the expanding nation. Rebecca returned to Pine Ridge with federal authorization to establish the Institute for Inclusive Territorial Development. which would train community organizers and government officials in implementing adaptive settlement policies. The institute would ensure that her innovations continued evolving while reaching populations she could never serve directly. The grand opening of the institute, held in Pine Ridge's new community center, brought together representatives from throughout the Western Territories along with federal officials and journalists who documented the ceremony for national audiences. The event celebrated not just Rebecca's personal achievements, but the systematic approaches to inclusive development that were transforming territorial expansion policies. 2 years ago, I arrived in Pine Ridge believing that my prosthetic leg made me unsuitable for the demands of frontier life, Rebecca told the assembled crowd during her dedication speech. Today, I understand that my disability was actually preparation for developing exactly the problem-solving abilities that territorial leadership requires. As the celebration continued into the evening, Rebecca found herself surrounded by evidence of how completely her life had been transformed. The institute that bore her name would train thousands of community organizers. The medical center she had designed would serve territorial healthcare needs for generations, and the policy recommendations she had developed were shaping national expansion strategies. Daniel approached as the formal ceremonies concluded, carrying a letter that had arrived by special delivery during the celebration. Rebecca, this is from the territorial governor. It appears to be another appointment offer. The letter offered Rebecca the position of Colorado Territory's first Secretary of Community Development, a cabinet-level appointment that would make her responsible for coordinating all settlement and infrastructure policies as Colorado prepared for statehood. Mrs. Sullivan, the letter read, your innovative approaches to inclusive development have prepared Colorado Territory for statehood with policies that other states are already studying for implementation. We would be honored to have you coordinate our transition to full statehood while continuing to develop the inclusive principles that have made Colorado a model for the entire nation. As Rebecca read the appointment offer, she realized that her transformation was entering yet another phase of expansion and influence. The woman who had once sought basic employment to avoid destitution was now being offered responsibility for shaping an entire state's development policies. Daniel, can you imagine what that desperate woman at the train station would think if she knew she would receive such opportunities? Rebecca asked as they walked home through Pine Ridge's familiar streets. I think she would be amazed but not entirely surprised, Daniel replied thoughtfully. Your determination and problem-solving abilities were always there, waiting for circumstances that would allow them to flourish. That night, as Rebecca prepared for sleep in the home she and Daniel had built together, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from desperate mail order bride to territorial leader whose influence extended throughout the American frontier. The prosthetic leg that had once seemed like an insurmountable barrier to acceptance had become the foundation for developing systematic approaches to adaptation and inclusion that were transforming communities across the expanding nation. Her personal struggle to find belonging had evolved into principles that were creating opportunities for countless others who faced similar challenges. Most importantly, Rebecca had discovered that her worth as a human being had never depended on others' perceptions of her limitations. The strength and capability she possessed had always existed within her, waiting for circumstances that would allow them to be recognized and valued. As she drifted off to sleep beside Daniel in their mountain home, Rebecca understood that her story had become larger than personal triumph. She had proven that individual determination to overcome limitations could create systematic changes that benefited entire populations, transforming not just her own life, but the lives of countless others who would follow in her footsteps. Mail-order bride who had arrived with nothing but hope had become a territorial leader, whose legacy would influence American expansion for generations to come, proving that every limitation contained within it the seeds of extraordinary achievement, for those brave enough to plant them and determined enough to nurture their growth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.